ready for Junius on the persons of the Father and the Son, Theses 10 and 11. So I think, what do we say, 13 theses on the Father, and Junius is working through them patiently and deliberately. So to get my bearings, we're still inside the doctrine of the Father, but we're now especially turning to the idea of eternal generation, but considered from the Father's side. So Junius is about to talk about the Father generating the Son, and try to bring out more explicitly what it means to affirm the Father as the one who generates the Son. And for a couple of strategic reasons of clarity and communication, he wants to loop back to the idea of creation as a point of contrast and say, on the one hand, there's the generation of the Son from the Father. On the other hand, there's the production of all things from God. And it's worth kind of getting these on the table at the same time so you can look back and forth at them and say, oh, broadly, they're both productions, right? And then go on to the more important point, I think, of distinguishing what kind they are.
Yeah, I think that line of contrastive ways is really the central element here. Thesis 10 gives some description of this eternal generating that the Father engages in producing the Son, and then it gives us some understanding of that off the negative of thesis 11. It's saying it's not like God creates the world in every way. So it's pushing into that ever greater dissimilitude we've mentioned before as a way to get around, some understanding on the backside of this eternal act of generating.
Yeah, great. And just to clarify the genre of these conversations for our devoted fan base out there who's listening in on these, I think we are likely to sound more confused than we actually are at a couple of points in this discussion.
Speak for yourself.
Well, it's not like we have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about the generation of the Son or things like that, but we're trying to track Junius's way of expounding this. And so a lot of our questions are like, why does he go back to that at this point? I think I mentioned what you would normally do in interpreting a difficult author is read around in the entire corpus so you got a sense of how he works. Now, you've read and translated quite a bit of Junius Disputations. Of course, the gold standard for a way to get to know Junius is to get the volume on true theology. And in On True Theology, he does have short theses followed by a couple pages of exposition of what he means by the thesis. So in this case, what we're doing is we're looking at these theses, which are now in your English translation. And just about the time I get to the end of one of the theses, I think, now I'm ready for a couple more pages of Junius explaining this in an alternative set of terms, possibly, or specifying what he means by some of these terms. And we don't have that. So it's kind of without a net.
Yeah, I think that's also just part of the genre as disputations. These are condensed lecture notes that Junius would expound in class over, an hour, 2-hour lecture for his students week by week by week. So not having him necessarily here to hold our hand and explain what he actually means by all these sort of things. The other trick is that sometimes some of these disputations are partially written by students. And so I felt even translating this piece that certain moments of explanation of the way things are phrased, they tend to make me think of that a student rather than a really trained theologian like Junius is writing some of these things. That's just a pure hypothesis on my part, but it makes the task of interpreting just that much more difficult.
Yeah, I definitely pick up that flavor. It's not like, the Leiden synopsis is also a series of disputations, and in that case by multiple authors. But you do get more the sense in most of the Leiden synopsis, the synopsis of a purer theology, that they're laying it out the way it ought to be laid out. Like, this is how you teach it. Whereas this Junius disputation feels more like an exercise, and you're not sure that he's saying, now at this point, we're ready to deal with this topic because that's the right order of instruction. It's more like, no, this is kind of how it came up in a student dialogue and now it must be dealt with well. So, yeah. But anyway, the project here is to sort of enter into this dialogue with a great theological mind, and we don't have there is not other Junius on the Trinity that you can consult in English in order to sort of get your bearings here. So that's the yeah, if I were advertising this, I'd say that this is the cutting edge part, is like, here we are on YouTube doing Junius on the Trinity from primary text. So, all right, well, let's jump into 10. Now, because the Son also subsists in se from eternity, we do not say that the Father is the principle of him in act or in time, but in beginning only. This is because the Father, a se and in the unity of essence, has eternally begotten him. Okay. What's clear here to me is that the Son is from the Father, but Junius is wanting to say, not in every sense. You wouldn't want to say the Father is the principle of the Son in act or in time.
Right.
Now, act is a little weird. Time is really clear, really obvious why you wouldn't want to say the Father is the principle of the Son in time. Yeah, but he is the principle of the Son in beginning.
Right.
Yeah, but it's a timeless beginning, obviously. Anything to add there about act?
Yeah, I think that you know, if maybe we were talking about this in the order of learning and how someone gets a hold of this idea, we would start by denying temporality and those types of general modes that most people, even on a basic instinct level, they've been in church all their life, they've read the scriptures, they understand that this is the type of thing that the scripture very clearly and very openly denies. The Son was before all ages begotten from the Father, and these sorts of things. If you start to ratchet that up into the more metaphysical level, there are certain other negations that are in the same line of denying temporality as characteristic of the Father's begetting of the Son. One of them would be denying that the Son is ever in potency to the Father, and to reflect that from the Father's side, picturing him as, you know, from the active generating side. We to express that, we would say he's not the beginning of the Son in act. He's not principling. He's not producing the Son as an act produces something which is in potency to it. And so what this is the highest and most sophisticated Arianism, which brings the Son all the way up to being the first creature, brings the Son all the way up to you know, many by many negations of lower creaturely status, nonetheless still has it that he's the highest angel, as it were. So especially in the high medieval tradition, or the tradition of Petrus Lombardus, and which is where this is coming from. It's really in the high medievals that we start seeing this act potency really becoming part of the theological vocabulary. You see that the way we describe the highest angel or the first creature, the first intelligence, to use Proclean language or something like that, would be that no matter if they're infinite in their being, they're still in potency to God. They still receive or participate and shorten what they're given. So they're always not God essentially, and always less than God. And that's, I think we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the difference between accepting and receiving. That's at play here. So receiving, you're in potency, and you are shrinking down what is being given in your own mode as a recipient, whereas denying that of the Son ensures we don't think of him as a creature.
Okay. Yeah. So that's, you can feel the air getting thinner up there, as you have to say, if you're thinking about these, a very high form of Arianism, a very refined and philosophically sophisticated form, that can even say something like, the Son is from the Father before all time, because time is a creature created by the Son after, if you can use the word after, after the Father begat the Son. And so when you've cleared the hurdle of said, well, this doesn't happen in time, so it's not old-fashioned Arianism. You don't say there was a time when he was not. because time came about through him. And there's this, yeah.
Time would be governing the material world, and then above it would be the angelic world, which are beyond time.
Yeah, and that's usually there's an appeal to Hebrews where in the Greek it says the aeons were created through him, not the cosmos, but the aeons. So there's some room there to hang some meditation on time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so then when you get up to that next level, you have to say, it's fine to deny that he was created, that he came about in time, but you also have to deny that he came about as the act emerging from potency.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and Fred, this makes me wonder, what are the sorts of, so we can get crazy metaphysical really fast, but what are the sorts of concrete ways of leaning towards this error that when we're talking to people, we just want to avoid or help steer them away from expressing things in those lines and thinking things in those lines? What are the things we're looking for to steer away from?
Yeah, especially if you're not walking around thinking about all of reality in terms of act and potency, right? If you just don't have a kind of a Thomist undercurrent running at all times. I think if you were to make the error of thinking of the begetting of the Son as a move from potency to act, you would be putting process into the divine being, like not just life or dynamism, which in some way life is definitely good, dynamism is probably good depending on how you define it. Sure. But process can almost never be a good way to be thinking about the reality of the divine being itself. Kind of a move from state A to state B, even if you say it's not chronological or temporal, it's still like first God this, then God that.
Right. So process is like irredeemably bad in the sense that you just can't place it there, and no matter how many negations follow placing it there, you just don't start.
Yeah.
And be much better off in the long run.
Yeah.
That
Yeah. And so if you were doing this in sort of really immediate ordinary language and said something like, once upon a time, the Father carried out the act by which he begat the Son.
Right.
You would immediately say, okay, clear the board. Let's start cleaning this up a little bit. It's not once upon a time, because time is specifically excluded. It is not the act of begetting, if by act you mean this kind of structure of act and potency. And so you go into that refining process. And I think in a minute, well, a few theses down, Junius is going to give us an explicit discussion of whether you should say begat, begets, or is begetting.
Yes.
Which is it's not a real common way of thinking about it. But it's in Lombard and it kind of messes with Calvin's way of expressing himself. And so that'll be interesting. But this is the same kind of thought. Like, should I say begat, begets, or is begetting? Should I say that the generation of the Son is an act? Or should I not say that? And so there might be a clean way of saying that it's an act. But Junius is saying, no, we have to think of the Father as principle, but not in time and not in act in this sense.
Yeah, in the sense that it would place the Son in potency as somehow becoming the Son at some point by virtue of his Father's engaging that act.
Yeah, and I don't just want to be a language cop on this, especially when people are talking out of different backgrounds and frameworks. But if someone were to talk about the act of the generation of the Son, I would just have to stop and say, I don't want to be an enforcer or go totally analytic on you here, but please define what you mean by act in this context. So, yeah, and you could only go forward if it was a definition of act that excluded potency. Yeah. Okay, this note, Junius says, this note, notice this, was not with a categorical begetting power, which pertains to corporeal things, producing per se and de se externally through a power, a corporeal substance similar to themselves. Not with a transcendental one, which pertains to spirits, begetting through their engendering faculty, something per se and internally. Rather, the Father has begotten with a wholly divine begetting power, per se and internally through his nature, a person similar to the Father himself. So lot of complex language here. The basic move is to contrast the wholly divine begetting power per se and internally through the divine nature, which results in a person similar. To contrast that with, what are we doing here? Physical creation and spiritual creation?
Yeah, I think so. Either physical creation, like a man engenders another man, or spiritual creation in the sense of what proceeds in a knower within his intellect, and specifically an angelic knower, but human beings, insofar as they are also have intellect, would also participate in that as well. So two ways of begetting, either by begetting a word spiritually,
Mm-hmm.
or begetting a son physically, but both of those are affirmed as the mode by which the son is begotten, but not in the exact way one to one that an angel begets a word or a creature begets another son.
Okay. Okay, good. And angels are really, really there in that second one, right? The what Junius calls the transcendental power, which pertains to spirits begetting through their engendering faculty, something per se and internally. That's the well, that's the production of the internal word,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. And it's a bit strange language. It's definitely a very sensible. It is transparent why Junius is choosing this language, is speaking of categorical versus transcendental. I will say though, it's very non-standard, at least from my experience of the tradition. I've not seen these types of explicit words, even though the ideas are, of course, deeply traditional. So just something we ought to keep in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think, is it most helpful on that second one to be thinking of angels or intellects? Or is that just a false dichotomy? Like,
It's yeah, if I were teaching this, I would probably remove the angels from the board, because I think that could just steer people into a long discussion that they don't need to talk about when we're focusing on Trinity.
yeah.
If we want to talk about angels, we can do that some other day. But the transcendental one is that which transcends the material order.
Okay.
And
Okay.
there's a part of man that likewise transcends the material order, which is his soul, roughly speaking, or his intellect, maybe speaking a bit more traditionally.
Okay.
And this is the production of a word.
So you could do an Augustinian verbum mentis here, the production of the word from the mind, and then maybe say, yeah, it's kind of psychological analogy in a sense, straight out of Augustine as developed by Thomas.
Yeah, and I think it's running both lines that's really important to underwrite. So when Junius closes with this really fascinating phrase, a person similar to the Father himself, the idea of similar there is not at all operating with the essential level. It's the idea of similitude that is yielded through this mode of proceeding.
Yeah.
So to contrast it to the way that the Spirit proceeds, the Spirit does not proceed such that by virtue of his procession, the mode of his procession, he is the similitude of Father and Son. So the Spirit is not the Son. Whereas the Son does proceed through the mode of a word or a nature. Both those lines are such that by virtue of the type or the
Mm-hmm.
way of his procession, he is the image of the eternal God. So similar there is functioning only on the personal. They're equal in essence, all
Yeah.
three persons. And for that reason, both these lines produce that concept of similitude, both creating another son in the material order and begetting a word from the intelligence. And so traditionally, these are both included, and that's why they're running here concurrent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. And we didn't say much about the physical production. Externally, through a power, a corporeal substance similar to themselves. That's begetting and passing on the human nature to another one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, good. And there's a couple other things here that Junius unpacks that with. It's the se language, right? Something is produced per se in the transcendental and the spiritual generation, per se and internally. Whereas in the physical generation, something is produced per se and de se externally.
Yeah, I don't really know what Day Say is doing here. I'll just be frank.
Yeah.
I think it's focusing on the partitive aspect of the material order, such that things are being split off, as it were. We would really want to clean that up metaphysically, but I think that that's the contrastive. Uh, the Father does not partition half of himself and clone himself like he takes a little cell and then he throws it over there and then it blows up into the sun. That would be the idea that would be being denied here very strongly.
Yeah. Well, once you start thinking about physical generation, you are gonna do partitioning, and you're gonna do a family tree, right? Like that's how propagation occurs.
Yeah.
Out it goes. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Was there something else? Anything else in 10 we want to get before we go on to 11?
I think it's fairly expressed, even though the language is
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when I was reading it out loud the first time and I got to the affirmation that the Father produces per se and internally through his nature a person similar, I stumbled a little bit because I thought, well, I don't want to say that the Father in his essence and the Son in his essence are similar. That's homoian-Arianism. But as you pointed out, no, it's not about the essence. The essence is identical. Father and Son are similar.
Right.
We could say things like they are equal, they are similar, they are.
Yeah, the equal, identical would be in the essential line or the essential bucket. Those are all things that we always want to be very, very quick and ready to do.
Yeah.
The idea of similar, which is left hanging here, I will say, like if you didn't know, there's this very deep tradition of distinguishing not to get too technical or speculative here, but the formal principle by which the Son is begotten is the idea or the ratio technically of intellect or nature, such that when the Father produces the Son via this, it's specified that the term or what is yielded, the Son himself, from that production is going to be a similitude or an image.
Which is why the Son is the image of the Father. And that's not language we can just port over to pneumatology and say, oh, well, I guess since there's fromness over here, then the Spirit must be the image of the Father and Son. And that's where this tradition would say, no, you're missing something there about the particularity of these relations.
Yeah, that's when you get to the Spirit, that's where this precision really starts to pay off. And I think, at least my read is, we often today have a temptation to really tend to make the Spirit as something like a grandson or something like a second son. And part of that is coming from the very good and right inclination of sameness in essence. And so that the similitude that is essential, the Spirit does have, such that he's even identical, right? But the mode of his procession does not yield by virtue of that mode of similitude in the personal line. Rather, he is the love rather than the word, not the image, but the bond and the union.
Nice. Yeah, and I think there is an instinct to say, well, I do not want to rob the Spirit of anything that I have specified of the Son, because equal glory, equal dignity, equal honor, all of, equal identical essence, all that. But the problem is, it's odd to say this about these kind of metaphysical distinctions, but the problem is you float free of the actual biblical revelation. And then you blow things like, we are not transformed into the image of the Spirit. We are transformed by the Spirit into the image of the Son. Now those are economic, those are even experiential statements, right? In the process of sanctification, but they're all grounded in Trinitarian revelation.
Yeah, and all of this is deeply replayed in missions and the logic of missions and the logic why the Spirit is not incarnate.
Yeah.
but the Son is incarnate, because when you look at the man Christ, you see the Father, because the man Christ proceeds as the eternal Word through the mode of that which, when he
Yeah.
comes forth, he is the image, whereas the Spirit is that who's invisible and connected with grace and love, and he's the first gift. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So the Spirit wouldn't say, not only wouldn't the Spirit doesn't say and wouldn't say, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father and the Son.
exactly.
Even if the Spirit's undergoing a visible mission with accompanying physical signs, you know, the dove of the baptism is not gonna, you can't say, I've seen the dove, so I've seen the love of the Father and the Son. Like, no, it's not imaging
Yeah.
in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. It's expressing the love bond, and love is very, very difficult. The metaphysics of love, and especially as we get to Trinity, it becomes even more complicated. But yeah, all of the making visible of the Spirit, the visible missions in the dove, none of which are permanent, if we can use that type of language, or enduring in the way that the human nature hypothesizing in the person of the Son is. But all of these making visible, are to attest to something that is invisible, which is a testament of the love of God.
Yeah.
So it ushers us into that idea, rather than, when I want to know what God is, I look at the Son. When I want to know that God is love, I look to the Spirit, and
Yeah.
that's.
And you just use language like expressing, or I would, you could do biblical language like witness or testify.
Yes.
But not like show or represent or image, because that's, you're not only kind of getting the metaphysics of the Trinitarian stuff wrong, but you're also drifting from the characteristic way the Bible repeatedly chooses to talk about the third person, who I guess we're not supposed to be talking about because this is a treatise on the Father and the Son, but but that's clarifying. And 10, I think, was the heavy lifting. So I think maybe 11 doesn't do quite as much, and kind of applies some of that. So thesis 11. And so this highest generation, not the physical, not the spiritual, or to use his language, not the, I'm sorry, what was it, categorical and transcendental?
Yes.
Yeah. So this highest generation, in whatever way it has been adumbrated in part in the nature of created things, still it surpasses creation in infinite ways, on account of the infinite inequality of the two who are similar. And you provided there, what the two are, the principle and the principled.
In this case, the second being the creature. Yes.
Yeah. For example, in the Father, for example, the Father per se begot one similar, just as all begetters with a corporeal nature, a person, like men do. Nevertheless, the Father did not do this outside himself, because the essence is infinite, simple, and pure. He did not beget an essence, because the divine essence is single, but begot in himself through nature as spirit, but not through faculty, because he is actus purus. Okay. So it kind of ends with a bang there.
Actus purissimus.
Yeah. Though that does make me glad that we spent some time talking about act and potency at the beginning of 10. Because otherwise this would have just been, on my first reading, I missed the act potency distinction at the beginning of 10. And so at the end of 11, when he just drops actus purus on us, I think, well, what? I mean, sure, I agree, but where did that come from?
Yeah, and I don't know, Fred. I don't want to go against your good sense and general intuition here, but I personally think that thesis 11 is doing heavier lifting, at least in my opinion, than thesis 10. There's just so much packed in here, and
is that because it ends with pure act?
Not really. I think the first, so there's two halves here, right? There's the general statement, which is the first sentence, that contrasting or rendering the dissimilitude express and explicit between creation and generation. And then it keys that out in all the sorts of negations and affirmations that we would make, in particular in lots of concrete ways that help us bring this really to the ground. And so even these last negations, like the Father doesn't do this outside, so we say he does it inside. And then
Because there is no outside.
Right. And if he were outside, then Arianism, and it would be potency and all those things. And but then even this last idea, which is connecting up with the negation of the transcendental way of begetting, which was talked about in Thesis 10, when he says he begets in himself, the Father begets in himself through nature as spirit, but not through faculty.
Yeah.
It's a genius move. And that's really frequently missed. So when we say that the Son proceeds through the mode of intellect, such that the idea, the ratio technically, of intelligence specifies the mode of his processions, of his procession. This does not mean that the intellect is anything other than the pure essence of God. In contrast, the way that creatures beget words in their intellect, they don't beget sons in their intellect because their faculty is really distinct from their nature. That real distinction is not present when we get up here doing Trinity. And so the Word, who is eternal, proceeding through the faculty of intelligence, of the Father's intelligence, because that faculty is not really distinct from the essence, he proceeds as the Son himself.
Okay.
It's just such a genius move, and it's really important.
Yeah, and so I'm aware that the Reformed Orthodox use Thomas's language about processions, the kind of the metaphysical development of the Augustinian way of talking about this, but they're a little more standoffish about it.
It's true.
But Junius here kind of leans into it and says, no, it is definitely procession by way of intellect, but not through a faculty, and kind of does the move that you just did.
Yeah.
I guess that denial, like, but not through faculty. It could work in two directions. One is what you just said with simplicity, that, the divine intellect is not part of God or a real distinction from the divine essence or anything like that. But also to deny that it's through faculty is if you're making the diagram, you do Father, Son, and Spirit. If you put in the Father a faculty of begetting, right, or a faculty of intellect or anything like that, that's an error. You're writing things in there that are things that belong in the divine essence.
Right.
Yeah. Even though the Son doesn't beget, but you can't say that's because he lacks the Father's faculty of begetting, which is part of the equipment of this person, but not of the divine essence.
Yeah, so we would say he has the faculty of intelligence in the mode of Son, receiving it from the Father.
Well, and once again, it's a long way around, but it gets us right back to how John's Gospel prologue talks, right? Is in the beginning was the Word was with God and was God. Was the Word a faculty of God, or was the Word just God? Well, those are both put out there. It's in some way the Logos is fully divine, and in some ways the Logos is like another person, like another people, and in some ways the Logos is like the mind of the Father.
Yeah.
But you have to transcend those, those vague similarities and say, well, then what is the Logos? If in some ways it's like somebody else, and in some ways it's like the mind of the first somebody.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you mentioned just a moment ago that there's a tendency among the Reformed Orthodox to deeply appreciate the tradition, especially the fathers, mostly, of course, but also the high medievals, to appreciate where they're good, but not to follow them slavishly, and also at times to be standoffish. When they adapt these analogies, psychological analogy here is really doing a lot of heavy lifting. They're following the pattern and cadence of Scripture, which is, I always like to say it's where God kind of hands us the analogy for Trinity.
Yeah.
And not to the exclusion of other analogies, of course, because
Right.
there are many other analogies also present to Scripture, but other ones that are possible to help gain some understanding of this mystery. As long as you function with them correctly and you don't collapse what God is into the illustration, and
Yeah.
remember to illustrate, we'll do all right. Yeah, in your experience, Fred, have you had good success with the psychological analogy? Things we should be wary of? Other analogies that work well?
Yeah, I think, as long as you avoid the error of thinking that Scripture is giving you a model in these statements. So it's not a psychological model,
Okay.
but a psychological analogy. That is to say that it is illustrating or developing something that is true about God. And yeah, it's giving you, it's at least the trailhead of a pretty elaborate psychological analogy. And that's throughout Scripture, including like the Holy Spirit is in 1 Corinthians analogized to the human spirit. So
Yeah.
who knows what's inside of a person, of a human being? Well, the spirit of a man knows what's in a man. And likewise, it's just right there. Likewise, the Spirit searches the deep things of God.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so the third person of the Trinities is in a certain way like the human spirit that has this kind of self-knowledge or searchingness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, well, we probably need to just park it there because Junius ends his sentence with actus purus, and so there's more work to do there, sort of unpacking what pure act Trinitarianism gets you, which is, considered from one side everything, right? Gets you the whole package, but we would need to be able to sort of build this out and see where it fits in the overall presentation.
Sounds
all right
great.
Well, when we come back, we can pick up thesis 12.
All right, Fred, look forward to it.
All right.